Do you think numbers win wars? Wrong. The reality of spring 2026 is exposing a brutal paradox. Russia's massive scale is no longer an asset, but a noose tightening around its own neck. While the Kremlin remains obsessed with drawing ambitious offensive arrows on its maps, it fails to see that more troops simply mean more targets for the hunt. Why does a supply corridor 150 kilometers deep collapse so easily against tiny, cheap drones? The answer is clear. Ukraine has turned warfare into a data-driven game, where stagnant Soviet steel is helpless against the agility of silicon brains. Never confuse massive with mighty. In this arena, the heaviest giant is the easiest one to bring down. The drone trap and the 150-kilometer dead zone, when mass ceases to be an asset and becomes a liability. Moscow began the spring 2026 campaign with a familiar plan. They believed that massive logistical corridors running from the border directly into the Donbass would serve as unbreakable lifelines. But reality has proven otherwise. Ukraine has proactively transformed these routes into a large-scale drone trap. Russia's efforts to overwhelm through sheer mass appear to be colliding with a harsh technological barrier. This is no longer about traditional long-range artillery duels alone. The battlefield is now defined by a dense presence of unmanned systems ensuring every military movement is under constant lethal surveillance. The most notable development is the abrupt expansion of the danger zone. Ukraine's drone control zone has stretched from 50 kilometers to a staggering 150 kilometers behind Russian lines. This represents a significant leap in both technical capability and tactical thinking. At this depth, the concept of a safe rear for the Russian military has practically ceased to exist. Supply trucks, ammunition depots, and reinforcement units are frequently hunted down long before they reach the front. Stretching this danger zone has directly fractured Russia's ability to accumulate forces at strategic hotspots. It is an invisible but highly effective barrier. As logistics become mere target practice, military doctrines based on masses of steel begin to show clear vulnerabilities. Supply convoys face the risk of being neutralized around the clock on every single road. Ukrainian drones do not merely attack in isolated waves. They operate as a continuous, systematic, and highly precise encircling network. What is the result? Frontline troops frequently find themselves lacking the necessary supplies to maintain operational intensity. Russia's offensive tempo has slowed down significantly. Ambitious arrows on the map have now become high-risk advances fraught with heavy and unexpected losses. An annual drone production projected at 3 million units is a telling figure. Ukraine is currently maintaining an unprecedented density of attacks across the entire front line. Every Russian mechanized vehicle appearing within a 150-kilometer radius has a high probability of being destroyed by a cheap FPV. Simultaneously, deep strikes against energy infrastructure have severed supply lines at the source. The combination of overwhelming drone numbers and data precision has created a pincer that strangles force reconstitution efforts. Attrition warfare has shifted into a new form. In this arena, scale no longer guarantees a strategic victory. The secret lies within the Delta system. This is a digitized brain that allows Ukraine to mark and process target data in near real time. Information from sensors and satellites is fused to provide immediate targeting instructions to various units. In contrast, the Russian military continues to operate based on fragmented command islands. Information between ranks is frequently severed or suffers from slow feedback loops. This disparity in digitization levels keeps Russian units in a perpetual state of passivity. Despite holding an advantage in raw hardware numbers, they struggle to engage in modern, highly coordinated warfare. This situation explains why offensives at Pokrovsk or Kupiansk are reaching a stalemate. Although Russia has funneled massive equipment into these sectors, quantity appears unable to translate into battlefield dominance. Advanced units are often broken during the initial assembly phase itself. Unable to protect their supply chains, Russia is forced to overstretch its manpower to guard vulnerable routes. This undermines the intent to concentrate power for a decisive breakthrough. They cannot gather a large enough force without being detected early by drones. The more they try to pack troops together, the higher the risk of loss becomes. Ukraine does not necessarily need to eliminate every enemy soldier to gain a tactical advantage. Their method is more logical. Make the road to the battlefield more lethal than the front line itself. When logistics are strangled, the strength of a division will naturally weaken from within over time. Russia is having to adapt to an invisible and sophisticated surveillance network. Every meter of progress is demanding a very high price in both manpower and equipment. This is the clearest evidence that the mass doctrine is facing an ultimate test. The new era has little room for inflexible and outdated military mindsets. An army might not be defeated while the territory is still held, but it begins to fail when every path to the objective is transformed into a trap. Russia is facing a dilemma born from its own massive scale. The more troops they deploy, the greater the pressure on logistics. The risk of being hunted by drones increases accordingly. Spring 2026 may be remembered as a strategic breaking point. It is where traditional steel masses must find ways to survive against intelligent algorithms. The old military doctrine is being challenged by an irreversible technological revolution. The future belongs to whoever masters the flow of data. The war economy and the manpower crisis, when Putin's machine begins to devour itself. As artillery falls silent on the front lines, another war is erupting deep within the heart of Russia. This is a war of numbers. It takes place on balance sheets and recruitment rosters. Moscow is directly facing a harsh reality. Putin's war machine is consuming resources faster than it can replace them. The stalemate in Donbass is only the tip of the iceberg. Behind it, a structural exhaustion is quietly gnawing at the nation's foundation. The Kremlin is losing its grip on the country's core economic variables, leading to a state of strategic gridlock that appears increasingly difficult to reverse. Early 2026 data reveals a troubling paradox. For 4 consecutive months, casualty rates have officially outpaced mobilization efforts. Monthly recruitment targets are becoming a distant dream. In reality, new contracts average only about 940 people per day. This figure is 16% below the minimum threshold required to sustain the war effort. If this trend persists, the Russian army is certain to face a shortage of at least 65,000 soldiers by year-end. This void is unfillable. It is not just a shortage of personnel, but a decline in the actual combat effectiveness of the entire modern military system. The problem is not just about quantity. The quality of new recruits is also a significant question mark. Those signing contracts in 2026 largely belong to the most vulnerable social groups. Approximately 24% of new recruits are actually under criminal investigation. Another 40% are carrying debts they cannot possibly repay. When patriotism fades, money becomes the only remaining leverage, but finance has its limits. When even massive bonuses fail to fill the barracks, confidence in a swift victory has clearly shattered long ago. The system is running on momentum rather than genuine national resolve. Where weariness has reached the megacities, Moscow and St. Petersburg are recording record low recruitment numbers. Rates have plummeted by 25% compared to the same period last year. In response, authorities are aggressively implementing harsher administrative coercion measures. Students are being forced into signing contracts directly at their universities. Businesses are being told to dedicate their employees to the front. These are not the signs of a nation confident in victory. On the contrary, they expose the desperation of a machine wringing out the last drops of human resources to maintain a facade of artificial stability. The Russian economy is also falling into a dangerous trap. Experts call it growth in poverty. GDP growth is projected at around 1% for 2026, but this figure is actually a financial mirage. Money is poured into defense plants to produce shells and tanks. These items will be destroyed on the battlefield within weeks. Russia is growing by consuming accumulated assets rather than creating surplus value. National wealth is being incinerated in the furnace of war, leaving behind a civilian economy that is increasingly hollow and lifeless. This masking of decay with military spending is a recipe for long-term disaster. The excessive focus on the military is causing profound repercussions. The civilian sector is facing an unprecedented and severe labor shortage. As skilled workers and engineers are pushed to the front, essential industries begin to decline. High inflation and interest rates are direct burdens weighing on the shoulders of the people. The economic structure is being distorted to a point where returning to normalcy in the near future is unlikely. Russia is wagering the future of its next generation to pay for the strategic blunders of the present. The cost of this gamble will be felt for decades to come. Another fatal weakness is the depletion of Soviet-era stockpiles. After years of consuming material, the rusting heritage in Siberia is gradually hitting rock bottom. Refurbishing old equipment is no longer sufficient to compensate for losses caused by drones and precision weapons. Furthermore, the shortage of high-end components is turning new weapons into soulless blocks of steel. Russia must fight with technology from the last century against an opponent operating on artificial intelligence. This lag is not just about firepower. It is a fundamental rupture in modern military thinking between two different eras. In summary, Putin's machine is devouring itself to survive. Each month the war drags on is a month Russia loses more than it can regenerate. This decline does not lead to an immediate explosion, but rather to a prolonged and painful structural devaluation. When resources are depleted and the people's will is exhausted, the strategic breaking point will only be a matter of time. An empire stubbornly clinging to a muscular past is gradually collapsing under the pressure of technological reality. This silent decay is more terrifying than any direct military defeat on the battlefield as it erodes the very bedrock of the state, the Kremlin echo chamber, when trust cracks before the regime falls. By spring 2026, the true front line is no longer confined to the muddy trenches of Donbass. It has reached the Kremlin's nervous system. This is a war of information. The chasm between rosy reports and harsh reality is widening. The regime is eroding silently. A nameless breaking point is emerging. This is a kind of crack that no air defense system can shield against. The nation's stability is being placed under immense psychological pressure. It is a state of decay that appears increasingly difficult to reverse or even manage effectively. The most dangerous signs today do not come from the suppressed opposition. They come from the insiders. The Z-bloggers, once the most loyal cogs, are now starting to change their tone. Figures like Ilya Ramaslow have openly criticized the military command's lies. When the most ardent supporters start questioning the war's social trust collapses, this dissonance is a harbinger of a deep crisis of legitimacy. Moscow is losing its ability to mobilize voluntary support from its core layers. The state is finding itself isolated even from those who once championed its cause. The core issue lies in the echo chamber within the power structure. In a highly authoritarian system, negative information is ruthlessly filtered. Officials report only what leaders want to hear to keep their seats. This leads to strategic blindness. Leaders believe in a self-constructed reality, while the actual ground has long begun to fail. When a system can no longer self-correct based on true data, mistakes follow one another. It is a self-destructing loop that any empire should fear. Without honest feedback, a centralized power is merely blind to its own approaching end. Information control now extends into digital spaces. Strangling Telegram is a risky double-edged sword. Politically, it helps control opinion, but economically, it destroys business flexibility. Telegram is currently the payment and coordination infrastructure for millions of small businesses. When the state prioritizes control over efficiency, it weakens its overall strength. Brutal interference in the digital space only increases inefficiency and transaction costs for society. It alienates the most productive segments of the economy, driving them into a state of silent but profound resentment. The Russian social atmosphere in 2026 is defined by diffuse weariness. There are no mass protests. Fear of repression remains too great. However, citizens are withdrawing into a state of passivity and indifference. This is a form of silent resistance with devastating power. Trust in the state's ability to solve problems is hitting rock bottom. When resignation replaces enthusiasm, the regime loses the energy needed to overcome crises. A nation operating solely through coercion is always a fragile nation. The outward compliance of the masses masks a deep-seated lack of genuine national unity. Approval ratings for Putin must be interpreted with more caution. The 80% figure is often a reflection of fear and a culture of obedience. In an authoritarian system, support exists only as long as the war remains distant. But as economic pressure and conscription reach every household, this acceptance will vanish. The regime is losing its thinnest foundation, voluntary consent. When people no longer believe in the state's narrative, all statistics become meaningless. The gap between what is said and what is felt is becoming an unbridgeable canyon for the ruling elite. Russia is undergoing a process of comprehensive structural devaluation. The state must spend increasing amounts of energy just to maintain a fake normalcy. Current stability does not come from prosperity. It comes from coercion and information filtering. As this shell thinks the underlying weakness will be exposed. Russia is not collapsing in an immediate explosion. It is declining significantly in quality, from its technology to its core social trust. The empire is hollowing out from within, even if the outer paint remains polished. The machine is running out of the political fuel it needs. The greatest breaking point does not lie at the burning borders. It lies at the moment people realize the state's story no longer matches the country they live in. This gap cannot be filled. A psychological collapse is difficult to avoid. The Kremlin may still hold absolute power, but that power hangs on a thin thread of doubt. Spring 2026 marks the final chapter of an illusion built on deception. The future of the empire is now nothing more than a large and uncertain question mark. The path forward is shrouded in the fog of a failing central narrative. When rusted steel from the past collides with the artificial intelligence of the future, the outcome is rarely a military victory, but rather the bankruptcy of a systemic mindset. We are observing a colossal entity crushing itself under the weight of its own obsolescence. Numerical mass, once the Kremlin's pride, has become the very cage that imprisons them. This decline is not an explosion, but the long, weary sigh of a doctrine that has reached its expiration date. A nation determined to use raw muscle against the flow of data will inevitably find itself trapped behind the curve of history where strategic blunders are paid for with the prosperity of generations to come. This is no longer a struggle for territory, but a historical purge of outdated models of power. Do you believe a nation's strength in this century should be measured by the number of bayonets or by the processing speed of silicon brains? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and hit follow to join us as we deconstruct the rawest truths of a global geopolitical landscape that is shifting by the hour.